Welcome to Nick Fletcher, lead guitarist of the John Hackett Band. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us about the release of your new album, The Cloud of Unknowing, here at progressiverockcentral.com. It's good to have you on. And I love the title of the new album, and I noticed there were several books and articles written on the subject, but tell us a little bit about the meaning behind the album and what it's all about from an author's perspective.
Okay, well, great to see you, Mark, and great to catch up and chat. And thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, so The Cloud of Unknowing, it is quite an unusual title. The title itself is taken from a piece of medieval writing by some sort of anonymous monastic person, and so it has kind of like spiritual overtones to it, and I thought it was an appropriate title to use for the concept of the album, which is about really to do with sort of an inner journey to find a bit of meaning in life and purpose in what would be very difficult times, because I wrote it during the lockdown period, yeah. So that's basically the sort of gist of the thing.
All right. Well, I can't go too far without asking this one. What is it like playing in the John Hackett Band? John and Steve are just wonderful people. I've met Steve. I haven't met John yet, but Steve is just fantastic. But they're great people to work with, and I imagine they're great to work with creatively. How did they and you cope with the rigors of COVID-19?
Well, I've known John now for about probably about 12 years. I didn't know at the time, but I discovered that actually John lives in Sheffield, the same as me.
Oh wow!
He used to live in London, as does Steve still does, but John moved north quite a number of years ago, and I met him purely by chance because I was doing a solo concert in Sheffield, and unbeknownst to me, John was in the audience. And then after the show, John came up to me and said how much he'd enjoyed the concert and how much he'd enjoyed my playing and everything. And then as soon, of course, as he mentioned his name, the penny dropped, because obviously I'd known of Steve and John for many years, like yourself, going way back to the 70s. So it was great to meet him, and then John said he was interested in doing some duets together because he obviously is a fine flautist. So that's what we did, and that's how we got together. And as a result of that, I kind of ended up becoming friends with Steve as well. I've met up with Steve many times and had great conversations with Steve as well. And then John decided about sort of 7 years ago he wanted to form a band. And he didn't know that I actually played electric guitar. I kept it very quiet because I hadn't played much electric guitar for a while, not professionally. When he was putting this thing together, I said, well, I wouldn't mind having a go at doing a bit of that. And and so I started playing, and he suddenly realised, oh yeah, you can play the electric guitar. So so and that was it really. So then I became part of the band, and I've been part of the band ever since. And it's always good fun working with John. He's always very easy to work with. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, they're a great family, very down to earth people, and a lot of people think that at least Steve is a rock star, and he's never gonna talk to you, or he's gonna be aloof, but he definitely is not.
No.
He'll talk with anyone. He just very salt of the earth, good kind of person that.
Absolutely, yeah.
We're gonna miss. I mean, we don't have those type other than you, and but from these younger generations, I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But
I know what you're saying. Yeah,
it's hard to find people like that. They just, even though they're stellar, Jimmy Page is another one. He's my third favorite. Again, I've never talked to him, but. He seems very down to earth as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jimmy Page was an influence on my playing when I was growing up. He was one of one of my first rock guitar heroes, really. Yeah.
Yeah, as he is for everyone. How did you? Obviously, you made it through the COVID, but what was it like from your perspective? I mean, we were lucky. We stayed in and stayed away from everything. You probably did the
Yeah.
same.
It was. It's a two-edged sword, really. I mean, on one hand, it was difficult because obviously, as a musician, getting out there playing became impossible. So there was no chance of concerts. I mean, all our band gigs were cancelled, and and all my solo work was cancelled, and so that was difficult. But on the other hand, I'm quite I'm quite into writing music quite a lot, and so having the time being sort of locked in didn't bother me too much from that point of view. Because I thought, well, I'm going to use the time that I've got, as best I can to start creating more. And so I created. Well, I finished off the first album that I was working on called Cycles of Behavior, and that came out in February last year. So during the first sort of lockdown, I was finishing that album off, and when things opened up, we managed to mix it, so that was good. We timed it right for that, and then once the lockdowns were eased this year and middle of last year, I started work on this new album, The Cloud of Unknowing. But because I was sort of inside all the time and not able to go out and do much, I decided to concentrate on writing that album. And so when we could meet up, it was ready to go, and start recording. Yeah.
All right. You studied a lot from the ancient masters who have passed through similar circumstances in the past and gained insights into how they survived and thrived. That's what I've noticed in an interview you did. What's some of the knowledge that you gained from those studies? And I think that was an excellent idea. I wish I had done the same. But I'm kind of a history major, so I've studied a lot of it, but I've never studied the writings that you talk about. But tell me a little bit about that, because I'm definitely interested.
Yeah, I also looked at it. I looked at quite a lot of Greek mythology as well, and it was all about trying to understanding, from the past how people interpreted their circumstances and how they used mythology and metaphor to sort of make some kind of understanding of their psychology, basically, and their sort of like psychological position of what was going on around them. And I thought that a very intriguing sort of subject matter. And I thought, well, for the album, that intrigued me, that I could sort of try and write some kind of suite or music which kind of delved into that and tried to understand a little bit more of the processes of our psychology and when we're meeting trauma and difficult circumstances, and to find meaning and purpose in it, because obviously it's sometimes when life gets a bit bleak, that's hard to do. And I think the music was therapeutic in itself to do that, Yeah.
Well, I don't have the CD yet. What was the quote from St. John of the Cross that you used on the cover or something like that?
Yeah, well, the quote that's actually on the album. It's on I've got it with me. Do you want me to read it?
Please, yeah. No, I don't have it. I wanted to comment on it in the in the review, but didn't have it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the quote is that the higher he rises, the less he understands, because dark is the cloud which illuminates the night. That's why he who knows remains always unknowing, transcending all knowledge.
Wow.
Which I think is a kind of interesting statement. It's almost paradoxical in some respects. It's almost like, to know, we need to unknow, and that's been a real sort of trajectory of my sort of life, really, is that so many times you kind of think you know about things and you think you understand, but you don't. And I think the less that we know, sometimes, the better, because we're able to engage more with what's really going on in life, with reality, rather than coming at what we experience from a preconceived perception of reality. So it opens up a lot of possibilities of thought and avenues of exploration through all of that. So that kind of it kind of spoke to me, that little quote. And also it harks back to this other monastic writing that was actually by somebody else called The Cloud of Unknowing. So whether St. John of the Cross got that from him, I don't know. But yeah, interesting.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. All right, let's talk about the album. The Eyes of Persephone. Tell me
Persephone.
Persephone. Yep.
I
knew I'd make a mistake on that.
Yeah, somebody said it was why it was called The Eyes of Persephone, and I thought, no, it's not Persephone, it's Persephone. So.
Persephone. It makes a lot more sense. Yeah, Greek, I'm sure.
That's it.
Tell me that you weren't influenced by Steely Dan. I'm definitely a Dan fan. Asia is my favorite album. I hear Asia a little bit in that.
Yeah, well, I took that as a huge compliment, Mark, because I mean, they're such a phenomenal band, and their music has always been something I've really enjoyed. So to sort of you picking up on that was really interesting. Because often, I mean, when you write these things, you don't. There's never a deliberate quest to translate.
You're not copying.
But these things come out, don't they? We're kind of all. Well, I'm a kind of musical sponge, and I've over years I've just assimilated all sorts of stuff, and it just becomes part of who you are. And then when you start writing, it kind of comes out. So it's interesting how people pick up on different aspects and different things. But that was great that you could hear that. It's lovely. Yeah.
They even, for those of you that are listening to this, if you're into Steely Dan, I found out about this, I don't know, just a couple of years ago, but they actually have a dictionary out on the internet to help you with their terminology. Because a lot of people don't realize, but there's stories within stories within stories in their lyrics, and a lot of people just take them at face value. But it's SteelyDanDictionary.com. If you get a chance, just take a look.
I'll check that out. Yeah, I didn't know that existed. Yeah, great.
Yeah, if you're looking for something to do on a cloudy, cold weekend like we have in Seattle a lot, it's a perfect place to go. It'll open. I thought they were talking about this. No. They were, it's just really cool.
That's interesting, isn't it, when you find that out? Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Describe the creation of that maximum opus, The Cloud of Unknowing, parts 1, 2, and 3, the title track.
Yeah. Okay. So that's quite a long piece. It's interesting because that particular piece is written. It's in 3 sections, but actually it's part of a bigger overall concept called the subconscious mind suite. So it has a lot of. That whole subconscious mind suite is all about taking the listener deeper and deeper into the realms of the subconscious, where we have to deal with issues and deal with ideas, particularly with this track, Cloud of Unknowing, of trying to find meaning and purpose. And so there's a kind of like an overall spirituality to it, really, in the lyrics and in the sort of questioning nature of the guitar work in that piece. But it's part of this bigger whole. And so each section that comes into that suite, the subconscious mind, it's a bit like the film Inception. If you've ever seen the film Inception, where where you're taken into different layers of dream states, and it's a bit like that. So each thing gets deeper and deeper, and also gets a bit darker and darker, till we have to do battle with the Hydra, which is the final piece of the suite. So where we have to kind of confront our demons, basically. Yeah.
That's a good one. Definitely. I like the Hydra too. Yeah, that's the whole song is just excellent.
Great.
Thank you for sharing that with everyone. Tell us a little about the talented musicians that you collaborated with, like Stuart Barber, Dave Bainbridge. I've interviewed him. He's an excellent person.
Well,
Caroline Bennett.
Okay. In the world of progressive rock music, obviously Dave Bainbridge is very well known. He's a fantastic artist in his own right, and he plays with bands like Life Signs and the Strobes and so forth. But I've known Dave for many years. We go back a long, long way. We're very old friends, and we used to work a lot together before we became professional musicians. So we've known each other a very long time. Dave doesn't actually live too far away from me when he's in the UK. He spends half of his year in the US. because his wife is an American, and so he spends a lot of time over in your, well, nowhere near you on the East Coast, in Baltimore. But when he's not in Baltimore, he's in Lincolnshire,
yeah.
in England, which is not that far from me. So I always like to be able to hook up with Dave and get him to play on stuff, and he's always very willing to do so, and he always contributes, fantastic things to whatever I've got that I've written. So he was an obvious choice, really. I also wanted Dave to do a bit more than he did on my previous album, because the previous album I did feature more of John Hackett. John featured heavily on flute and some vocals, but on this album, because it's a little bit more instrumental and also a bit darker and a bit heavier in his character, I thought that it would be nice to have Dave in the mix to bring his thing to it more so, rather than John, because what he brought to the previous album was perfect, but to this album it didn't seem to fit the sort of narrative of where the album was going and the feel of it. So he was an obvious choice, and obviously a fine musician. And this chap called Stuart Barber was an unknown to me, but my producer Caroline Bonnet, Stuart was a friend of hers, and he came on board through her, really, because I was struggling a little bit to find a singer who could really deal with some of the lines that I'd written because of the range. A lot of what I write is a bit angular sometimes in the melodies. They can go from low to high, and they're not normal diatonic melodies, and so some singers found it hard. But anyway, Stuart was able to do it, and I think he did a great job, and he's got a very English sounding voice, which is what I wanted for the project as well. So that worked out, really well. Although I'd not heard Stuart before, so it was a bit of a risk, but he did. I took my producer's word on trust there, and she got it bang on, so that was good. And then I've got a chap on bass called Tim Harries. Now, Tim's a fantastic bass player. I used to play with Bill Bruford in the band Earthworks, if you remember Earthworks, which was the sort of second solo project that Bill had. Because obviously he had his initial project where he did albums like Feel Good to Me and One of a Kind and so forth, with Alan Holdsworth.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, when that band folded, he was spending most of his time working with King Crimson. But then he formed this more jazz type band called Earthworks, and Tim came in as the bass player with that band. And I've known Tim a long time, and when I asked Tim if he was interested in playing, he was very interested. He heard the music and said he'd love to do it. And he's a very versatile player. He can turn his hand to anything. So he was great to have Tim on board with it all. And I also got Russ Wilson, who's a fine drummer, and he plays in a couple of Genesis tribute bands. And I met Russ through John, because sometimes John gets asked to make guest appearances with some of these tribute bands, playing all the sort of flute parts that Peter Gabriel used to play on the early stuff. And so through that, John said to me, well, why didn't you get in touch with Russ? He's a great drummer. I think he'll be the man for the job. So Russ has played on both my solo albums, and this album I gave him a bit more freedom to explore what he wanted to do on it, and I think he came up with some great ideas and worked with the brief of what was required really well. Yeah. So, and then there's a friend Caroline who's also my producer, and she's a fantastic producer and sound engineer, but also she plays great keyboards, and she's a backing vocalist as well. So yeah, so that covered all bases for anything that needed doing that Dave wasn't doing with the keyboard department. Yeah. So good band. Yeah, I'm very thrilled with having them all.
Yeah, I think you put together a great group of people for sure.
Yeah, they're fabulous.
You sound a little bit like Steve Hackett. I mean, how could you not? He influences so many people in the world. But I hear a lot of it in the Paradox Part 1 and 2. I mean, I hear a lot of different songs. I think I put some of those album references in the review I did. But
that's right.
What's one of your favorite Hackett albums? And you want to talk a little bit about the Paradox and how it has similarities, or go ahead.
One of my favorite. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I I was a big fan of Steve's, obviously when he was in Genesis and his early solo work. I mean, obviously that's how I first heard of John on the first few albums that Steve did, because John was playing on them all, and I loved all of them. Fantastic recordings. And then I kind of Steve went out of the scene for me a little bit. I didn't really follow much of what Steve was doing. I was into other things, and I was getting more into my classical guitar, and I kind of didn't hear much of Steve for quite a number of years. And then I kind of got back into his playing when I actually around the time I met John, I was starting listening to more of Steve. So it's quite interesting, quite ironic that I actually bumped into John. And so that sort of middle period of Steve, I don't know much of. But the later stuff and the early stuff I know quite a lot about, and it's all been a heavily sort of, influential stuff to me. You wanted to know about the track called The Paradox?
Yes.
Well, that particular track, originally I thought it might be an instrumental, but then I suddenly realized that I felt that it needed some words, and I started trying to put some words together, because I felt it needed a bit more to sort of clarify the narrative of what I was trying to say with the music. So words were very important on that track. And the interesting, the second part hadn't been written. It was just, that was the piece, the Paradox, to part one, as it were. And then when we were recording, it kind of concluded, and it kind of felt like it needed to go somewhere. So whilst Caroline was out of the room, because she was recording the thing at the time, I came up with the part two idea. And when she came back, we recorded some of that. In fact, we recorded all of it, and stuck it onto the end of part one. And it just seemed like the perfect sort of complement to the track, because the first part of the track is quite intense in a lot of ways, and there's some great synth work from Dave Bainbridge and guitar solos and big choirs and all sorts of stuff going on. It's so it needed like a kind of a coda which summed it up in a peaceful way, and to give everyone a bit of hope through the journey that we've been on throughout the entire album and that particular track, because it's quite a big track, in its production and everything. There's a lot going on in it. So the last part kind of opens things up and is a bit more spacious, really. And like you say, it's probably reminiscent of some of the sort of early Steve work that he did. In fact, that if I'm honest, that last part reminded me a lot of one of my favorite Genesis tracks, which was the Dancing with the Moonlit Night. And if you remember that track from Selling England by the Pound, it finishes with this kind of long outro of pretty quiet stuff. Steve playing some very, very interesting, guitar parts with some really sparkling sort of guitar sounds, and then Peter Gabriel comes in with some lovely flute, and it's very English sort of pastoral sort of setting, And I think that was in the back of my mind actually when I was writing that piece. And, I think that's the kind of vibe I was after. Yeah.
It sounds like you're gonna tour this album in the UK. Any plans be in Europe or beyond, or?
Well, I'm hoping to get some work together next year, promoting the album. Doing anything outside of the UK is really difficult at the moment. We had this thing where we left the EU, and for us, it's made life very, very difficult for touring musicians to get over there. The red tape has become very, very difficult, and also the cost has become pretty prohibitive. So if you're a big artist, you can swallow the costs, but if you're not, it's really difficult. So it's kind of made life very complicated and awkward for a lot of musicians in the UK. So I don't think I'll have the logistics in place to be able to do that next year. But you never know.
Yeah, you never know.
It would be nice.
Well, is there anything else that I've not discussed that you would like to mention?
I don't think so particularly. I mean, I'm happy to talk further if there's anything you can think of, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else to talk about that you've not covered already.
Well, Nick Fletcher, thank you very much for taking this time to talk with us about the release of your new album from the progressive rock hackcentral.com, and we hope that you definitely have continued success and all the pathways lead up. And I'm sure that
Well, thanks, Mark. I much appreciate that. I mean, I'm embarking on writing the third album as we speak. I've been working on it today. Yeah. So that's watch this space. Hopefully, something else will be coming probably next year. So.
And
that's
anything new from the John Hackett band, or?
Yeah, we are actually we are currently well, in a couple of weeks' time we're in rehearsals doing some working on new material. So we are planning and hoping to get a new Hackett band album out next year. So it could be a busy year. Yeah.
Yeah, as they all are, but that's good.
Yeah.
Better to be busy.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Anyway, great speaking to you.
Definitely. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time. And hold on just a second.